Okay, hello and welcome to this lesson on how the Normans changed education. This lesson is going to be particularly useful to you if you're an AQA GCSE history student and you are studying the Norman England unit. However, it could equally be useful if you're OCR or EdXL and you're looking at Norman England, or indeed if you're Key Stage 3, so if you're in year 7 to 9 and you're looking at the impact of the Norman conquest, so how the Normans changed everyday life after William took power following the Battle of Hastings. For this lesson, what you're going to want to do is get yourself a pen and paper ready so you can write things down. Start by getting this title down, and then we've got 4 keywords today. If you need to pause the video here to copy down those definitions, that is absolutely fine. And what I'll now do is go over some of those definitions. So, first keyword is rhetoric. And that basically means the skillful use of language. So if you think about spelling and grammar as being like the nuts and bolts rules of how language works, rhetoric is about using language skillfully. So being able to speak and write well, persuasively, and impressively, that is rhetoric. Second, we have got vernacular. Now, vernacular means the language spoken by ordinary people in a particular region. So rather than it being the official or sort of high class language, this is the language that is used every day by ordinary people. That is the vernacular. Keyword 3 is grammar school. Now, we still have grammar schools today, but they had a slightly different meaning in the Norman period. So the grammar schools were focused especially on the learning of language skills. So they're all kind of narrowly focused on that. And at this time, that especially meant Latin during the Norman period. Final keyword is a tricky looking one, monasticism. Now, all that means is the way of life in the monasteries. So the word monasticism has come from the word monastery, and it just describes the way of life of the monks and nuns that lived in those monasteries. Okay, so where are we going in today's lesson? What are our destination questions? Well, there are 2 that we are going to try to answer. First one, what was education like before the Normans? If we want to know how the Normans changed education, we have to know what education was like before the Normans came along. So our first one is, what was education like before the Normans? Then secondly, we are going to consider, how did education develop under the Normans? So once they were there, once they were in power and in place, what did they do to the English education system? Okay, so I would like to start with an image today. Just take a few moments to take in this image, see what you think you can see in it. Don't be tempted to analyze it too early. Start with the basics. What can you just visually see in that image? So hopefully we have noticed that there's this man in the middle sitting down. We've noticed he seems to be writing something. So he's got some sheafs of paper open there, and he appears to have a writing implement, a quill, in his hand. Now then, maybe moving on to the analysis. What do you think he is doing? I'll give you a few moments to consider this. Okay, so I'll tell you the story of this man now. This is Aelfric, and Aelfric was a Norman monk who translated a Latin textbook into English for the first time ever in the year 990 AD. So this monk translated over a Latin textbook, and that is sort of one of the first hallmarks of what you might see in modern education. We still have textbooks now, and this man brought it from Latin, a language that the English would largely not have been able to understand, and turned it over into English. So the way the lesson is going to be structured is using a timeline. So I'd like you to pause the video on this slide and copy out these times as timeline headings for yourselves. And then we're going to make a few notes under each of these headings. This is before the Normans turned up. So education in England before the Normans. Okay, so starting then in the year 43 AD, this is right back when the Romans were still in charge in England. So they'd come over, they'd conquered the English, and they were running the country. And this is how their education system looked. So they started by introducing schools into major English towns. In these schools, it was really only the children of the rich that could attend. And then even among those, it's mainly boys. So there's very little education of girls at this time, and certainly no education of the poor. The schools are focused on rich boys for the most part. In terms of the language that was getting used in the schools, that was Latin, because Latin was the main language used by the Romans. In terms of what they're being taught, the teachers were focusing on grammar and on rhetoric. So remember, that was our first keyword, the skillful use of language. They wanted their pupils to be able to speak and write this language, Latin, correctly and skillfully. Then we're coming on to 400 AD. So this is actually after the Romans have gone. Now, the rise of Christianity in England made the use of Latin even more important. But why would that be? Just take a few moments to pause and see if you can guess why that might be. Well, the reason is Latin is the official language of Christianity. It's seen as the language that supports that religion. And so as Christianity becomes more important in England, so too does Latin in the year 400. Towns by this point were actually starting to decline. And what that meant was schools were starting to close down. So they had been attached to the towns, but once the towns declined to a certain point, there was no longer a sort of viability or realisticness to the schools carrying on. So they started to close down. And where they were closing down, it's the church that ended up stepping in to replace the schools as the educators. And they set up schools in their monasteries, and the monks in the monasteries take on the teaching roles. So whereas before schooling was done almost as its own thing, now the church is taking on responsibility for education. Despite the importance of Latin that we mentioned, because Latin was the Christian language, the number of people who could actually speak Latin declined at this time, and the vernacular was getting used more. So just English was starting to be used more in the country than Latin. Okay, so on towards the year 500 AD, we see some more shifts in language in the education world. Welsh, Irish, and English all start coming into more use for things like poetry, local laws, and customs. So again, vernacular is kind of on the rise here. However, in the education world, the official language is still Latin. So Latin is being used for all educational and religious texts at this time. However, teachers also did begin to teach foreign grammar. So as well as Latin, they were starting to learn languages like French and German, along with others, through the use of grammar teaching. Okay, moving on from 600 to 1000 AD, we start to see some new subjects coming in. So monks and nuns, they're still teaching in the monasteries, and now a small number of students are girls. So this is a turning point, perhaps, that you might want to draw out. The increase in the number of female students is still small, but it is starting to grow in this period. They're now taught subjects like theology, medicine, and history. And from the 9th century onwards, so that's the 800s onwards, lessons were in English. That's a big change. So before, it had all been Latin, the official language of both religion and education had been Latin. And now from the 9th century, lessons are starting to be in English. So that's a pretty big shift. And then in 990 AD, our man from the start, Aelfric, translates a Latin textbook. So this is one of the first ever examples of a textbook that you would see, and it gets translated into English. A little milestone moment there in the history of education in England. So you've now got a timeline with some notes for each section on education in England over time. What I'd like us now to consider is turning points on that timeline. So are there any, when you look back at that timeline, are there any major turning points in the road? Any points where things really seem to shift in a significant way in that history and on that timeline? If you had to pick out one or two, what would they be? So just take a moment now There's no right or wrong answer to this exactly. It's a matter of your own thinking and being able to back it up with evidence. I'll give you an example that I've come up with, but you're more than welcome to disagree on this. That's one of the beauties of history. Okay, so here is my one. I've gone for 400 AD, so fairly towards the start of that timeline. And it's where the church becomes responsible for education. So before, when the Romans were running it in a relatively secular way, so in a sort of separate way, in 400 AD, the church taking on the responsibility for it and ushering schooling into the monasteries, I feel was a major turning point. And it's one that lasts for a really long time in England. You could argue the sort of reverberations of this event are still with us today, because, for example, 25% of primary schools are Church of England. Even in modern Britain, the church continues to play a very significant role in the education of young people. So I would class 400 AD as a turning point. However, you may well have said lots of other moments, for example, when lessons started to be in English from the 9th century onwards, or you could even go with Aelfric and that first English textbook. So that's the first destination question. What was education like before the Normans? Now on to how the Normans themselves began to change it. So you may know from previous lessons, and there is one on Satchel about this, that towns were beginning to rise in importance under the Normans. And as the rise of towns gathered pace, there was a greater need for education. Pause the video here and see if you can think why. Why would they need to have better educated people in the towns? Okay, so if you said this was about trade, then you're absolutely right. The idea of the towns, the reason why the Normans wanted to encourage the growth of towns, was so that there could be more trade and more economic prosperity for England. So they wanted to encourage that kind of trade. But here is the hitch about trade. You can only trade well, it's only really possible if the people involved have got a good standard of literacy and numeracy. They need to be able to count for obvious reasons, and they need to be literate to be able to communicate effectively with each other for trade to be able to take place. It's not like farming, where you can effectively just be shown how to do it, and you could farm without really ever learning to read or write reasonably effectively. To be able to trade in the towns, you need a certain standard of literacy and numeracy. And the only way you're going to get that is education. And so education becomes more important in order to support trade. Along with that, the Norman barons also wanted their own children to be educated to a high standard. Norman reforms to monasticism, so if we remember that's one of our keywords, eventually meant that children were no longer allowed in the buildings. So children couldn't go into the monasteries anymore. And remember, that's where the schooling had been taking place. So that's a problem. And it means that education's got to happen somewhere else. So they have to create separate school buildings now. Now, because of that, the number of schools shot up. So by the 12th century, there were 40, and by the 13th, there were 75 schools. So a real sharp increase over that time period. The spoken language now, so this is a change, was French, but Latin is still respected as the language of writing and Christianity. Now, you may remember from the lessons on religion, these two men, Archbishop Lanfranc, who was eventually replaced after a brief period where William II took over himself, eventually replaced by Archbishop Anselm. And both of these men were really significant for Norman education. So Lanfranc had been a famous theology teacher himself. Theology means the study of God, effectively, the study of holy texts. And Lanfranc was a famous teacher in a monastery in Normandy, which became the most famous monastery of all Europe. Anselm himself was a student of Lanfranc, along with one of the popes, Pope Alexander II. And both of these men, they basically set about promoting education in England. They really want to make sure that all of the church schools are producing a literate clergy, so priests that can read and write, as well as encouraging literacy among ordinary people. So these two play a really key role in pushing forward education and encouraging it. Now, for that purpose, they build something called grammar schools. Again, we may want to refer back to our keywords for this. So the grammar schools were built in Northampton, Exeter, Lincoln, and Oxford. Now, a quick challenge for you. What do you think the school year and the school day looked like for Norman pupils when they were in these grammar schools? Pause and have a think. Jot down your ideas. Just a bit of fun, really, on this one. See if you can guess. What would it have looked like? Okay, so here we go. Some children, they join grammar schools from the age of 10 onwards. So quite similar to the age that modern children would leave primary school. And when they got to the grammar school, they would learn mainly about the Latin language, its grammar, as well as how to speak and write it well. Remember the key word for that, rhetoric, using language skillfully. In terms of the school year, it began in September and there were 3 terms with the final term ending in June. That might sound familiar to you because it's pretty close to how we run schools today, isn't it? The school year will begin in September. There will be 3 terms. And although we end in July typically nowadays, that's pretty close to June when the Norman grammar schools would break up. Another question for you then. Why do you think they had this tradition of a long break in the summer? So like our long summer holiday, theirs is even longer, June to September. Why would they have had this? You may want to pause here and discuss with anyone around you. Why have we got that? Why is there not a long holiday in winter instead or in another season? If you want a clue, have a think about the kind of work that was often going on in Norman England. So this is why. The break over the summer basically meant that all the children that went to grammar school, especially if they were from a peasant family, they could go back to their family and they could help with the summer harvest. So a crucial part of the life of a peasant over the year was gathering in crops during the summer, which would then see them through the rest of the year, especially the winter, where it was a matter of survival, how well they collected in crops in that harvest. So they needed their kids to come back and help, hence the long summer holiday. School would start each day as soon as the sun was up, so bright and early for the Normans. And much like us, there was a break in the middle of the morning and then one for lunch. If students were successful at these grammar schools, they could go on to university. So hopefully you're seeing that a lot of the way the Norman education system works remains in place today. There are still really lingering aspects of the Norman education system that we continue to use now. If they didn't go on from from grammar school, then they could go into various professions. For example, they could become a merchant, they could be a parish clergy or clerks. However, maths and law weren't taught in the grammar schools. So remember we said grammar schools, basically, they focused on language, the rhetoric and the grammar of Latin. Maths and law tended to be taught on the job. So if you were going to go and become a merchant, for example, you would learn your maths there on the job rather than at the grammar school. Okay, so we've come towards the end of the lesson. A final task to bring this together for you. Write an account of the ways in which education changed under the Normans. If you're an AQA GCSE history student, this would be an 8-mark question, and you probably want to write about 2 short paragraphs on this. Example sentence starter here. One way in which education changed under the Normans was in language. This was a significant change because. A second way education changed was the introduction of grammar schools and universities. This was a significant change because. So if you're able to provide evidence, so the explanation of the facts, and then a clear explanation on why that's important, then you're going to get your top marks, your 8 out of 8 on this. So if you want to pause the video here, give yourself about 10 minutes. You're more than welcome to re-watch the video if you need to make sure your content is secure and in place. And then we'll look at a model answer together on the final slide. Okay, so here's a model answer. One way in which education changed under the Normans was in language. This was a significant change because before the Normans, Latin had been slowly declining in importance in the education system. Although the official religious language was still Latin, from the 9th century onwards, lessons were taught in English, and Aelfric even translated a textbook into English. Under the Normans, Latin became central again, along with French. So looking at how the Normans had disrupted that trend towards English that had been slowly growing in the education system and put it right back towards Latin and also French, their language that they brought over from France. A second way education changed was the introduction of grammar schools and universities. This was a significant change because grammar schools remain a feature of England today, and the patterns of school life were similar in the Norman period to today. 3 terms beginning in September with a long break in the summer. The grammar schools and universities also encouraged a higher level of education than had previously existed under the encouragement of figures like Lanfranc and Anselm. So that's for you to check against your own answers, see if there's anything that you could add in. And well done for getting to the end today. So just a reminder of where we've been answering 2 destination questions. Number 1, what was education rather, like before the Normans? So we looked at how it had been under the Romans. We looked at how the church took over in the year 400, how language and subjects changed over time. And then our second destination question was how education developed under the Normans. So the introduction of separate school buildings after the reform of monasticism, the introduction of grammar schools and universities, and the refocusing on the Latin language. Well done for your effort and attention today, and good luck with the rest of your course.